Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and today we're going to do a viewer question program with a touch of, let's say, zombie opening material included as well. So not too many questions, new questions since the last time, and in fact one of them was retracted. But I think what's there is interesting, and as I said, there's also a comment from one of the zombie openings shows that I think merits a little discussion. So let's go ahead and begin with a question from, well, I'm not sure how to say his handle here, maybe Meridi RH, and he says this, more or less. So he says, I have a lot of time for chess, more than 5 hours a day. How would you spend it as a Class C or B player? Where would you spend more time and where less? Okay, and then he has some follow-ups, but I'll start with this. So first of all, it's one thing to think you have 5 hours a day on chess, but it takes quite a bit of energy, mental energy, not so much physical, though that too, but mental energy to really keep going for such a long period of time. So if you're really able to spend so much time on chess, you know, fantastic, but it might be more difficult than you think to really have 5 hours of good work a day. At any rate, if I were a C or B player, I would spend certainly a lot of time on tactics, a fair amount of time on endings, some on openings, but less. And also I would spend time looking at and trying to figure out grandmaster games on my own. So, you know, things like solitaire chess exercises, it doesn't really matter with the points. So, I mean, you'll have like columns in the United States. I think Pandolfini does one for Chess Life where you get points, and I've seen books like that, and I think Chess Monthly at one point, I think Danny King also gave points for responses. So, okay, I mean, it doesn't hurt, I suppose, but I think the points aspect is kind of beside the point, pun intended. Really what counts is you're putting in the effort to do the work. So, you know, like what I'll do is I'll take grandmaster games and simply go through them, trying to guess every move from the point where I'm out of what I would consider theory that I could use and know offhand. So it's not that the move is necessarily brand new, but it's beyond my general area of expertise. So I'll start from that point, and I don't care how many points I have or anything like that. I'm just trying to figure out the game as best as I can. I'll put a clock on myself, so you know, I play in these IM Norm tournaments from time to time, so I'll set the clock with that time setting, write down the moves, and after I'm done, then I'll enter the you know, what I put, how much time I spent in a chess base, or you know, whatever software you use, doesn't matter. You can do it in probably any PGN reading program. But I'll put what my wrong guesses were, how much time I spent, what I saw, or what I, you know, and then later what I missed. But I'll do that, and then I'll look at the game annotated by someone. So typically I'll only do this with games where I have substantive annotations, so I can really kind of dig in and see what the player himself thought about it. So I generally don't like looking at books where the author is someone other than the player himself. So if I'm looking at a Kasparov game, I want to look at Kasparov's notes, or at least a strong grandmaster's notes at worst, but you know, preferably by the original artist. So Kasparov's notes, Karpov's notes, Fischer's notes, Kramnik's, Anand's, whoever's, and then compare. And then finally, if I'm not sure about something, you know, then at the very end, I'll run the computer, but only at that point. So anyway, I think that's a useful exercise to do as well. And I would do all of that stuff more than openings. So a little bit of openings, you know, you have to learn it. You know, it's worth building up your repertoire a little bit at a time. But really, that's relatively low on the list. I mean, you want to achieve a certain degree of tactical excellence as quickly as you can. You want to develop your endgame skill, and you want to basically perform exercises that simulate what you're going to do at a chessboard when you're playing real games. And so the solitaire exercises do that. Tactics exercises can do that. Likewise with endgame study. Okay, opening much less so. So it's useful, it's important, but not the biggest deal. Okay, so continuing on with his questions, he asks, do you believe it's good to learn chess after Russian chess school principles? And he gives his examples. Don't play 1d4 until you've reached 1800, or play the king's Indian attack as white. Do you believe these? Do I believe that that's still valid, or is it old-fashioned? Well, one thing I'll say about Russian or Soviet chess school ideas is I'm not sure there is such a thing. So as I've read various works by Russian or Soviet grandmasters and reading them talking about their trainers and so on, it's not clear that there really is such a thing. So, I mean, in the old Soviet days, there was this propaganda where everyone had to salute Chigorin and Elyekin as, kind of like taking a pledge of allegiance in the United States, or, something that's kind of ceremonial. It doesn't mean that it's fake. I mean, those were great players, and certainly I think a lot of people, when they pledge, I mean, they mean it in their sincerity, but there's also kind of a ritual aspect to it, too. So, I think there's some of that. So you get this idea, there's the Soviet school of chess, and as if everyone, when they were a kid, they went to the palace of young pioneers, and there was some kind of established curriculum, and they all went through this like some kind of factory. That probably wasn't really the case. So, there are some bits of wisdom that I'm sure were common, partially because of the influence of major figures like Mikhail Botvinnik, but I'm not sure that there is such a thing as the Russian chess school. Okay, well, about these, let's say, bits of advice, like don't play d4 until you've reached 1800, okay, I think there's something to that. I mean, this general idea that when you're a weaker player kind of working your way up, and this goes with what I was saying about spending your time on tactics, that's a very useful thing to do. So you want to play e4, you want to play gambits, and generally speaking, do things that are going to facilitate your development as a tactician, as a player who has a feel for open games. So yeah, as a bit of good advice, general advice, I think that's right. Now I'm not clear about this King's Indian attack. I mean, is it that you're not supposed to do that until you're 1800, or that you should do that? So I would say don't do that at all, frankly. I think the King's Indian attack is kind of a mechanical setup. And maybe at a certain point, let's say if you're short on time, and you feel like you're kind of at a plateau or maybe even at a peak, and you don't want to spend a lot of time learning something against the French or the Sicilian, then okay, it's kind of a handy dandy thing to be able to play without worrying about a lot of theory. I wouldn't become addicted to it because I think it's, again, fairly limiting. And all right, until you're ready to have the dirt thrown over you in the grave, I think you should always try to learn more about the game. In part just because it makes it more interesting. But okay, I mean, there's nothing really wrong with the King's Indian. It's just again, there can be a kind of a mechanical aspect to it. Anyway, that's kind of how I would take things. So as you get stronger and stronger, openings become more and more of a factor, then the amount of time you spend on them should be greater. But okay, I mean, if you're a Class C player, Class B player, or even a Class D player, which is what you have in your little profile there, definitely tactics is number one, with endgames behind it, and again, trying to work your way through Grandmaster games. I think that's a good bit of advice. Okay, let me move on here. We're going to come back to the position at the board here. So that was asked by Arad 1288. But first, let me deal with the other kind of talky questions first. Okay, so Emstrom asks, he says this: Hi Dennis, I have a question regarding sealed moves in adjourned games. How do they decide which player got to seal their move? Did they have to seal it so many moves after the time control, or just when they felt uncomfortable in the position, maybe? When reading the older chess books, they invariably come to adjournments, and it has always baffled me as to which player was the one to seal their move. I have seen games where both white and black players have sealed their moves, so it was not a matter of sides, meaning colors. Okay, so those of you who are relatively young may have come across adjournments, or maybe don't even know what in the world he's talking about. So here's the way it worked. Once upon a time, before there were sudden death time controls, you kept playing and playing and playing and playing, and the time controls would repeat. So, for instance, the standard FIDE time control for decades was the following. You'd have 40 moves to make in 2.5 hours, and then after that, 16 moves to make every hour, and that would just repeat. So you got to move 56, you got a new hour on your clock. You got to move 72, another hour, 88, and so on. So obviously, a game could go on an awfully long time with that kind of policy, and some games really did go a long time. I mean, I think the record is something like 21 hours or 20 hours, somewhere around there, for the longest game as far as time usage. So they would adjourn games at a certain point, and the typical procedure was to adjourn after 5 hours of play. So obviously that meant after the first time control, because you can't reach 5 hours without someone losing on time if it's still in the first time control. So 5 hours would be played, and whoever's move it was basically at that point would seal the move. So they would write down their move on a piece of paper. That piece of paper would be stuck in an envelope. That's why it's called the sealed move, because the envelope would be sealed. And then when they resumed the game the next day or later in the week or a few hours later, I mean, it varied from tournament to tournament, the envelope would be open, the move would be executed, and then they would play for another 2 hours. And if it was still undecided, often there would be another adjournment, and on it went. So the length of the second session would vary, but often it would just be for another 2 hours, not 4 hours. In part because what they would do sometimes in tournaments is they would have a day saved up for all the adjourned games. So you might have 2 days where you play, and then day number 3 would be a rest day for those who had no adjournments, and a day to play off the adjournments for those who were not so lucky. So it was certainly made playing in tournaments even more work than it already is. On the plus side, the quality of play in endgames was much better, both because, of course, they had had time to analyze in the particular case, but also in general because people spent so much time working on adjourned games as a matter of course in their careers. They really developed some tremendous endgame skill. Okay, next question, and this is the one that was retracted from Andishmund. He says, could I possibly make a video tribute to David Bronstein? A few weeks ago, a friend of his gave him Bronstein's The Sorcerer's Apprentice as a birthday present, and he really loves it. It's just a great player. He thinks it would be wonderful if I made such a video. And then he wrote in a follow-up, and he said, oops, you've already done it, and basically suggests to everyone to look at the Play Chess server archive. So I also do shows, and have for about 5 years, for ChessBase's online server. So that's what the Play Chess server is. And I've done, I don't remember how many, but I've done several shows on Bronstein. So you can certainly check that out. But I'm certainly open to considering maybe doing like a kind of greatest hits program for Bronstein, where we look at, let's say, some of the tactical moments from his games. So rather than presenting full games, maybe I might consider taking a look at some tactics from his play. Part of the reason why I would only do it in that way is because I really do want to keep the two shows that I do distinct. So that way, you go to the one place for the one kind of show and here for a different kind of show. So over there, essentially what I do are these about hour-long programs where I typically take a game from chess history and kind of tell a story about it and talk about the players and the situation, and then look at the game in pretty serious detail. So over here, I try to do something different. So it's kind of a blend, occasionally some opening stuff, try to look at some things from viewers' games or from local club games or even games that I played. So just a kind of a different take. So for the full-length Bronstein games, you can check out over there. But again, maybe kind of a tactics greatest hits show might happen here. So we'll try to keep that in mind. Okay, so now let's finally look at some chess here, and the position we have on the screen is one that apparently comes from Jeremy Silman's Reassess Your Chess workbook. Now this I don't have, so I have a couple of his other books. I like them quite a lot. I mean, I can't say they helped me become where I am, for better or worse, because I more or less reached master status. Well, I definitely reached master status before I even knew of the existence of Silman, I think. But a lot of people have said really good things, and I've occasionally used his books with students myself. So generally speaking, I mean, I think he does very good work. At any rate, I don't have the workbook, so I just have How to Reassess Your Chess and The Amateur's Mind. Anyway, so he says, after looking at the position, this is from Era 1288, after looking at the position and reading Mr. Silman's thoughts, I decided to try to play the position after rook to b4, so white's move, rook to b4, out against Rybka. And he says, after time and time again failing to convert the position into a full point, I would love to hear your thoughts on the diagram position, the move rook to b4, and your opinion on what result would be correct with best play. Well, here I feel a little nervous because certainly Silman, I'm sure, has worked on this very carefully and has some good thoughts about this. And, frankly, Silman is, at least at his peak, I mean, he hasn't been active in a long time, but certainly at his peak he was a bit better than I've been at my peak. So I wouldn't say humongously better, but I have to give him the nod, to be sure. So between that and, again, the time I'm sure he spent on this and the fact that I don't know what he said, not having the book, I have a little bit of fear and trembling. But nevertheless, let's say a few things about this position. So I'm sure it won't be as detailed, but I hope it will be helpful. Okay, well, the first thing I want to say is, or I want to address, is this position here before rook to b4. And let's try to get our bearings about some things, and to talk about some general points concerning rook endings. Now, the first thing that we should say is that there's a pretty significant difference between single rook endings and double rook endings. So it may look like a small difference, but in fact it's really considerable. And the difference is that when there are doubled, or two rooks for each side on the board, the tactical element becomes far, far more significant. Of course, because the rooks can team up to do all kinds of nasty things, not just ganging up on particular pawns, but creating attacking play as well. So tactics is really, or tactical themes are really predominant when you've got both sides running around with two rooks. When you have a single rook, the play is much more, let's say, strategic and schematic. Okay, so that's the first point that I want to make. A second point that I want to make is that there's also a very big difference between rook endings where all the pawns are on one side of the board and positions where the pawns are on both sides. And typically, when all the pawns are on one side of the board, the drawing chances for the weaker side tend to go way up, especially in a single rook ending. So to illustrate this, let's take a quick look at a line like this. So rook to d1, rook c3, and now we want to activate the rook. So let's say g3 takes, rook d to d7, rook f8. Takes, takes, takes. Okay, now you might think that white is much better here. And if it were, let's say, more of a middle game, white would just be dead one. And depending on what the other piece, let's say it's an endgame with one piece for each side, depending on what that piece is, it could be more or less serious. So if it were a light squared bishop ending, then I think it would be a dead draw, or pretty close to a dead draw. If it's a dark squared bishop ending, then, okay, black is going to have some serious problems. If it's a knight ending, I think white's probably winning as well. The rook ending is in fact a draw. And not only that, I'm pretty sure, and this is true very often in situations where the defender has doubled pawns, the draw is much easier than it would be if we moved one of black's f-pawns to the g file. So just to set up one particular kind of position, okay, let's do this. And we'll just keep the rook active someplace. So this is kind of a useful spot, trying to keep white tied down to the f-pawn. And let's say white plays rook a6 with the idea of playing e5. So black just steps back, and what's white to do? So it's really very surprising. Doubled pawns are in fact often fantastic for defense in these kinds of rook endings. And the reason, or one reason why, is that it becomes much, much harder for white to create a passed pawn, or a meaningful passed pawn. He can make a passed h-pawn, but that's about as bad a passed pawn as is available. So we can't make a passed e pawn, f pawn, g pawn, none of those. So black is really in very good shape here. Now this pawn on h5 is actually quite useful. It can't be attacked by the king, so there's the doubled pawns coming into play again. And if rook to a5, no problem, just king to g6. We just go back here again, and white's really not getting anywhere. You could play e5, okay, it shouldn't be any big deal. Takes, rook takes, f6, and black is very, very comfortable here. So rook to a5, and we could either just sit here with rook to f2, or probably rook to b1 is pretty good as well, to start harassing the white king from the side, or just to leave the rook on b3, where it keeps all of these pawns under close watch. So white really has no winning chances here. Okay, let me look at one other idea with rook to d1. So again, rook to d1, and this time g4. So here the thought is we'll fix these pawns all the way back and not allow h5. And so this will give white more space relative to the last variation. But as we'll see, black is still really in very good shape. Okay, so you can see here with this g4 rook a5 setup. So we don't allow f5, we don't allow h5. So we really have black very his whole kingside setup is purely passive. But again, I think this purely passive setup is just good enough. The only idea, okay, so there's one more idea that I should mention, but I'm not sure that white can even set it up. Okay, so yeah, this is inconvenient, and now white has a choice to make. So either we play h5 or we don't. If we don't, then I think it's pretty well impossible for white to make progress. Actually, I think it's pretty well impossible for him to make progress anyway. If he plays h5, I don't really think it matters too much. So rook e2, okay, various possibilities. So rook to a6, and here actually we should be slightly careful. So see if you can figure out what black to move ought to do here. And not just so much as a one mover, but as a general policy. What should he do with his rook, basically? I mean, obviously the king isn't going anywhere, the pawns aren't going anywhere, so where does black's rook belong? Okay, well, one answer is just to put it on f2, so we can just leave it on the f file and tie white's king down that way. Or you could play rook to b2, and then the idea would be to go to b3, and this is perfectly adequate. What you should not do, though, is play rook to e1, because king f5, and this is going to win. So for instance, and now g5, so we break through, and white is way ahead in the race. So this is one little thing to worry about or to watch out for. But essentially, as long as you don't allow that, so here if king to f5, just rook to b5 check, and life is good. So the thing that I was mentioning before is another possible plan, so we can maybe discuss this quickly. So like rook to a5. Okay, actually I already looked at that, but let's continue it. And now rook to f5. Okay, so here the idea is that now everything is protected in white's structure. So this pawn is protected by the f pawn, which protects the g pawn protects the h pawn, the g and the e pawn protect the rook, and the rook protects the f3 pawn. So all very nice, all very convenient. And so here, what white will do is start to run with this king, come up, come over, come up, and okay, maybe try to do something like that. But this just can't work. I mean, even if by some magic he gets the king to e7, big deal. Rook to b7 check, or a7, or wherever the rook is by that point. So this is just hopeless. And in fact, it's even a failure right away, because rook a3, king g3, rook a2, and nothing doing. The king's not even going to make it across the board in the first place. So this is really a very, very easy draw. So going back to our starting position, this plan of trying to double on the 7th just leads to a single rook ending with all the pawns on one side and an easy draw. So rook to b4 is in fact a good move. Certainly a logical move. Maybe there's another move that is also as good and fits the bill. Well, what's the idea behind rook to b4? Seems to me that there are at least two clear points to this. One is that it puts the rook in a situation where it can easily defend the a-pawn, either by the a-pawns advancing or by the rook going to a4, where in fact it'll not only defend the pawn, but attempt to tie black down to his a-pawn. Okay, the second point is that white will use this rook on the king side as well. So we can bring the rook to f4 in some cases, which is a fantastic square, because here it puts pressure on the f-pawn, and it covers the f2 pawn. So one rook comes to f4, okay, we make some kingside luft move like g3, and then we bring, let's say, this rook up to d6, and really try to tie black down. Also, the rook can maybe come to d5 instead, and then head over to somewhere on the king side. So there are various targets. And another idea might be for white to double up on the a file. So there are a lot of ways where these two rooks can really work beautifully together to simply tie black down. So here are some sample variations. Okay, so let's say rook a to b8, aiming again for a single rook ending. Although here again, it's not quite the same as long as there are pawns on both sides of the board. But again, because white will be quite passive in a position like this. So rook takes b8, rook b8, let's say again g4, and now, okay, probably rook to b2, threatening rook to a2, and if rook to a1, okay, then we can play maybe a5, and white is really tied down. I mean, the black rook is perfectly posted. It, of course, puts pressure on the f-pawn, and the h-pawn maybe cuts off the white king, at least from coming across very easily. And meanwhile, maybe black even advance his king and play for h5 and f5 and try to swap off all the kingside pawns. So anyway, I think black is in very good shape here. Should be drawing this without much difficulty. So after rook b4, rook a to b8, rook to a4 seems to be the right idea. And now, okay, rook to b7. Black has to do something to protect this pawn. Okay, g3. We don't want to play g4 here because we'd like to keep g4 free for the rook. Okay, so now a couple of variations here. So one is, let's say we have black just kind of mark time here. So king g7, rook to d1, h5, rook d5, rook a6. So you can see, I mean, black is really getting kind of tied down here. White has a bunch of ideas. So one is to play rook d to d6. Another idea, which we mentioned before, is to maybe double on the a file. And even a third idea could be to play h4, followed by rook to g5 check. And then the f-pawn would hang in that case as well. So at some point, black will have to play something like rook to b6. Okay, rook takes a7, rook c2. And again, this constitutes no threat really, because rook to d4 and rook to f4 will keep the f-pawn adequately guarded. So for instance, here, threatening rook takes e3. So just rook to e7, rook a2, a4. And I think white should be winning here. Not easily, probably. Well, it might even be easily, frankly. The only question is whether black can... Okay, well, what black would need to do is to try to tie white down at the a-pawn, and if white counterattacks by something like rook d to d7 and rook takes f7, black would have to try to switch gears and counterattack against the f2 pawn, while white's rooks are unable to prevent this. So, you know, there are still some minor technical difficulties for black or for white to overcome, but I'm pretty sure this is a win. Okay, so back to the position after g3 here. Another try is to be a little bit more active for black, so rook c2 and rook to a2. But we'll see this is also very strong for white, so just rook to d6. That way if rook to b3, we can simply play rook d to a6, or rook takes f6, and on king g7 we check, and all of black's weaknesses kind of drop off here. So notice, when it was a single rook ending, these pawns were very stable. It was very difficult for white to put any meaningful pressure on them. In the double rook ending, though, it looks to be incredibly simple for white to really terrorize these kingside pawns. So I think this is this ending. Well, let me continue this variation a few more moves. Okay, so a5, rook a6, so good move. So that way black can't play rook to a7 himself. So we put the rook behind the passed pawn, which is where it belongs. Rook to b4, and now, okay, not the only way to win certainly, but a nice move is rook to d4. And now we just start pushing the kingside pawns, and white is winning here. So honestly, I think that rook to b4. Okay, it's one thing to beat Rybka, because I mean Rybka, I believe the questioner is lists himself as an A player. Well, okay, Rybka is probably about 1,000 points stronger, so it's difficult to beat anyone who's 1,000 points stronger than you are. Whether even if you start off with a big head start like you have here, but I believe, at least practically speaking, it's most likely a win, and I think even objectively speaking, it may well be a win. But as a practical matter, I think it's close to impossible for black to hold the double rook ending. The single rook ending, black has excellent drawing chances, and if the a pawns disappear, I think it just is a draw, and black doesn't even need to show especially good technique. Whereas again, if the kingside pawns were straight, if it was fg and h pawns for black, then the drawing task could be quite a bit harder, depending on what kind of kingside arrangement black or white can achieve. But with the doubled pawns, it's good for black in the single rook ending, and terrible for him in the double rook ending. Okay, so that is all I wanted to say about this example, and finally, I'm going to turn to a comment made by Nucleus, I'm not sure how he wants to pronounce his nickname, but he made a comment to my first opening, or Don't Be a Zombie show for openings, and he mentions the Caro-Kann. And so I had a few things that I wanted to say about that. Okay, so he talks about the advanced Caro-Kann, and notes that many people play c3 here, and that this in fact gives black a very comfortable game after knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, and e6. And in fact, in the database released in PowerBook, black even I think has a plus score in this position. So how is this an example of zombie chess? Well, if we go back, we should look at two similar positions. So e6, d4, d5, and then here e5 is a major variation, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, and so on. Of course, the big difference is that this bishop is locked in here on c8. It's a bad bishop. Whereas in this Caro-Kann variation, it gets to jump outside the box, so it's not trapped in by his own center pawns, and he can swap it at some point or leave it outside, leave it alive. Either way, it's a far better piece than in the French. So that's the first way in which this is a zombie approach for white with this quick c3. Okay, the second mistake, or let's say confusion, that perhaps is the white player is suffering from in this is to maybe think of I'm trying to think here. There's some similar variation, and it kind of popped into my mind and then popped back out again. So clearly, the main mistake is this advanced French confusion. So it's treating it in the same way, but also, okay, after e5, I mean, there's this variation with bishop to f5. Okay, and here, okay, this is more speculative, and I don't know if this is really a true zombie explanation here. But perhaps, okay, in these variations, white thinks, okay, the bishop's coming outside the pawn chain anyway, so no reason to bother worrying about it in this c5 variation. So I might as well just play like an advanced French. And indeed, I mean, there's a famous old game, and this is what really caught my attention, why I thought it would be worth, or especially worth, discussing this. There's an old game played in New York 1927 between Nimzovich, who had white, and Capablanca, who had black. And I think that game actually was a bishop to f5 game. So it went bishop to f5, and I think Nimzovich played c3 or bishop to d3. I mean, maybe it was bishop to d3, takes, e6, knight f3, c5, c3. I mean, it was very similar to this, if not exactly this. Knight c6, castles, and so on. Queen b6, etc. So, I mean, this may not be exactly right, but it was basically this idea. And again, it essentially worked like a very favorable French for black. So he got to make all of the useful French moves, while along the way getting rid of his bad bishop. And he went on to win a very, very nice game. And in fact, I think as a result of this game, for many years, the advanced variation against the Caro-Kann simply went out of business. So this just ceased to exist as a variation because, okay, bishop to f5, the bishop's just outside of the pawn chain. There's absolutely nothing going on for black. I mean, it's just a worthless line. So people started looking for other approaches. But the interesting thing is that people discovered that after bishop to f5, and here I think this is another sort of zombieism, right? So people just thought, oh, well, the bishop's outside of the pawn chain, so this must be great for black, and so we have to look elsewhere. So somewhere along the way, and I'm not sure who was the creative genius who realized this, but black's bishop outside the pawn chain could in fact become a weakness in some cases, because white can gain some time kicking it around. So, for instance, a very popular line a few years ago, and it's still important now, and you have to know it really, really well if you play this with black. Is this line with knight c3, e6, and then g4. So just super aggressive variation. So bishop to g6, knight e2, c5, h4, h5, knight f4, and white is gaining all kinds of time hitting this bishop, and it's just a very, very aggressive setup. But you can see, I mean, so we get this move with g4, we get to play knight f4, and sometimes it gets even kicked later on too. So just a very interesting, let's say conceptual anti-zombieism, where the thought is, okay, well, not just the bishop just got outside of this, so e5 must be bad, but to think, well, what might be the downside of this bishop getting to f5? And the realization was, well, gosh, we can maybe gain some time and develop an initiative by attacking it, and this has become a very, very important variation. At the moment, theoretically, it seems like black is okay, but this is the result of hundreds of games and tremendous number of hours of people slaving away at their boards and running their computers trying to figure things out. And even still, I mean, you have to know an awful lot to play this with either color, but especially with black, because white gets the initiative first. Okay. Finally, just to mention a bit of the theory of c5. So I agree wholeheartedly that c3 is not at all testing, and that black is quite comfortable in the variation that he mentioned. So the right move here, or at least what seems to be the right move, is d takes c5. Although I should mention c4 is kind of interesting. He mentions lines with an early c4, and this is one of them, just playing it straight away. I have to report my own suspicion. I don't believe that c4 is a move that'll stand the test of time. So it feels too committal, and I don't like seeing white's center get destroyed so easily. But it is very, very sharp, and certainly I think the last word on this has by no means been said. But at any rate, the main move here is d takes c5, and then black has two fundamentally different approaches. So one is to kind of go French here with e6, and just regain the pawn. And you might wonder, well, why is black doing this? He's going into a French, essentially down a tempo. But the reason is that this is a good line of the French for black, even without that tempo, so it may be worth it. So white has a choice again between a couple of approaches. He can be greedy with bishop to e3, and then black seems to do pretty well with knight to h6. Because if white takes, then white is just weak on all kinds of dark squares. So despite the doubled pawns, that bishop's being missing is going to be strongly felt. Of course, if he doesn't take, then the knight comes to f5, which is a very nice square. So that's one approach. Second approach is just to kind of embrace this French, set up and play knight f3, bishop d3, castles, and then black can either play with pieces, knight g to e7, maybe go to g6, or go aggressively after the center straight away with f6. Okay, so that's what happens if black plays e6 here. So the French approach. The more distinctively Caro-Kann approach is the knight to c6, and here white is kind of obliged to play greedy chess, because if he just gives back the extra pawn without really getting anything in return, then black is going to have very good chances for just an advantage, because he'll have these two center pawns and very comfortable development. So bishop to b5, simply preventing knight takes e5 is the main move. e6, stabilizing the d pawn and attacking the c5 pawn, but also blocking in the bishop on c8 again. So bishop to e3, more greed, knight g to e7, preparing knight to f5. So white plays c3. Okay, bishop to d7, again threatening knight takes e5, and it would be threatening knight to e5 even if knight to f3, because the bishop on b5 would be loose. I guess I should show this. So knight f3. Knight takes e5 can be played anyway. So if knight takes e5, bishop takes b5. And if bishop takes d7 check, of course, knight takes d7. So after bishop to d7, white takes on c6, and now black can recapture a couple of different ways. So if knight takes, this is very interesting. White plays f4, and now black can play g5. Kind of a typical undermining move in a lot of French variations for the last couple of decades, and it seems to be good here too. So for instance, if f takes, knight e5, knight f3, takes, and here black doesn't even bother trying to regain the pawn, but just develops and is going to have tremendous influence with his bishop here. And okay, the variation goes on from here, but black has some compensation thanks to the bishops. Okay, after bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, I don't know if it's better, but it scores the best. And this is after knight f3, we play knight f5. So we don't use the knight to try to go after the e-pawn. Instead, we're trying to exchange off that bishop at some opportune moment. So here, white plays bishop to d4, trying to protect everybody, but also turning the bishop into a glorified pawn. And then here, black has a couple of main moves. So one is just to follow through on the threat, grab the bishop pair, accept being a pawn down. But after c takes d4, okay, well actually queen takes d4 is the main move. On c takes d4, b6 was what I was going to suggest, and is very, very strong. C takes b6, queen b6, and black's bishops and also the queen here just offer tremendous compensation. It's got open files on the queen side as well. I think black is just to be preferred here. Black might even be better. So the main move here is queen takes d4, and then the position is very sharp. So queen to a5 is a possibility, and after b4, queen to a6, preventing castling. Another idea is to just play a5, trying to impede b4, but in fact, since b4 can be played, I'm not really sure what the point is. So takes, b6, cb, rook a4, a3. Yeah, this doesn't really look very impressive to me. I think black maybe wins a pawn back, but it's down 2, and I don't buy it. So I think this queen a5 approach is probably the better way to go. Anyway, so this is a possibility. The other possibility from back here is to play a5 straight away. And here, white castles or plays a4, to play b4 too. Anyway, it's theory, but black does quite well in this variation. But it's ongoing still. And again, I don't think the final word has been said about this. So, okay, a little bit of theory there for you. The main point was just, again, this sort of non-zombie approach. So e5, okay, on c5, or even on bishop f5. It would be bad for white to just play some variation where he swaps this off, as in the old Nimzovich Capablanca game. But if white realizes that there can be some fun had by kicking this poor bishop around, then play can be much more brisk and fascinating. And then finally, to not be a zombie here and play as if it was a French, but to switch things up and maybe play d takes c5 or the very sharp c4. Okay, well, I hope this has been instructive. So we had some historical questions, some philosophical remarks about training. We looked at some endgame theory here, and some endgames, or opening theory and some endgames. So hopefully a little something for everybody. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.